Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, despite concerns over a shift in US policy towards Russia, the US Special Envoy Kellogg is in Kyiv, where he's holding talks with the Ukrainian President Volodyrmr Zelenskyy and the country's foreign minister. During the course of the last 48 hours, the US President Donald Trump has turned on his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, accusing him of being a dictator and also accusing him of starting the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Kremlin reiterates it would be unacceptable for NATO countries to deploy troops to Ukraine. This is the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says he's ready to put troops on the ground as part of a peace deal. And US President Donald Trump vows to audit the amount of gold reserves being held at the famed vaults at Fort Knox. Hello and welcome to the programme. For the past 24 hours, there's been considerable focus on the war of words between the US President Donald Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Well, the already fragile relationship between the two men has deteriorated to a level that many would have considered to be unthinkable, with President Trump calling President Zelenskyy a dictator and accusing him of, quote, starting the war in Ukraine. He went on to say that he was making the United States then pay for it. He also labelled Zelenskyy as a modestly successful comedian, referencing his career in entertainment before entering politics. Well, President Zelenskyy has fired back, accusing President Trump of living in, quote, a disinformation space created by Russia. Well, President Trump's remarks have raised concerns about a potentially dramatic shift in US policy towards Russia.
He refuses to have elections, is low in the real Ukrainian polls. I mean, how can you be high with every city is being demolished? It's hard to be high. Somebody said, oh, no, his polls are good. Give me a break. Every city is being demolished. They look like a demolition site, every single one of them. And the only thing he was really good at was playing Joe Biden like a fiddle. He played him like a fiddle. That's an expression we use, Yasser, to say that he's pretty easy. A dictator without elections. Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast, because...
President Donald Trump speaking there while aboard Air Force One. The president confirmed that he does indeed trust Russia to negotiate the war in Ukraine in good faith.
Would you say you trust the Russians to negotiate in good faith going forward? Do you trust them?
I do. I think the Russians want to see the war end, and I do. I really do. But I think they have the cards a little bit because, you know, they've taken a lot of territory.
Well, for more analysis, we can cross to Kyiv now and speak to Sergiy Petukhov, who is a former Deputy Minister for European Integration of Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. The US Envoy Kellogg is in Ukraine. What sort of a welcome has he been getting?
He's definitely a person that everybody wants to meet, and he stated that he came to listen. And I hope that he does listen to what people in Kyiv think about the statements made by the US officials. Definitely, he's going to hear that Volodymyr Zelenskyy is not a dictator. He's definitely going to hear from all over the political spectrum and civil society that no one in Ukraine expects any elections in the nearest future, and neither thinks it's possible under the Ukrainian constitution, and that Ukraine expects the United States to stand as an ally in the negotiations, to have Ukraine at the table and decide the peace negotiations in a way that is favorable to Ukraine and not play the Putin cards.
Yeah, he's got a busy agenda, and he's got a tough job, hasn't he, trying to reconcile one narrative with the narrative he's now going to get there on the ground in Kyiv. And one of the other things he might get an update on, Sergei, is perhaps the reality with regards to Mr. Zelensky's popularity. What is the reality?
Well, the reality is that Zelenskyy is still quite popular as a president. And honestly, recent statement by President Trump made him even more popular. So people actually uniting behind him because they don't see the alternative. They don't want any elections right now. So it seems that he's getting the popular mandate from the people. And actually, he's even opposition leaders to lead these negotiations and negotiate the peace to the extent possible. So the reality is quite opposite to what President Trump stated. There's nothing close to 4% support. All the reports say that he still enjoys the 50% plus majority of the support of Ukrainians.
In terms of what he's been discussing there, I'm talking about General Kellogg. He's been meeting with your country's foreign minister, Andriy Sybiha, talking about this just and lasting peace. Has any more information come out with regards to the essence and the substance of their discussions?
Not really. We have not had any official statements so far. And definitely the two biggest questions are going to be for Ukrainian side is the security guarantees. If not NATO membership, what else can really guarantee that Putin will not restart the war as he repeatedly has done since 2014? On the US side, it seems that the question of some sort of control over the Ukrainian minerals will be raised as for some reason that has become an important question for President Trump, and he stated this publicly. Whereas, I mean, Ukraine is not in principle opposed to some sort of agreement, but it definitely has to be an equitable agreement. And also the security guarantees are something that are necessary for any of those agreements to be effective, as most of the minerals that we're talking about are either right now controlled by Russia at the occupied territories or really close to them. So again, I think the real conversation here is that, well, we're ready to give opportunities for US businesses, but we really want to see what are the security guarantees, the real ones that US is willing to provide for Ukraine against another Putin aggression.
Yeah, I'm going to talk to you a bit more about those in just a moment. But since you mentioned minerals and rare earths, I was going to ask you about that later. But do you think that history is going to look back on this Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war that your country's been through these last 3 years as having essentially been a war over these commodities, these rare earth materials? Do you think that's what this was all about from the beginning?
Not really, honestly speaking. I mean, we don't have anything that is very lucrative or exclusive. You know, the coal deposits that we've been having and exploring for the last several decades are now depleted and are too costly to explore. The other, minerals are not to the extent that make them, exclusive or extraordinary or lucrative. So this whole discussion about the minerals in Ukraine is really, I think, taking away the focus from the things that are important. And I think for Russia, it's not about minerals as such, rather about, controlling more of a territory within Europe, sending a signal to Europe that Russia is back to the times where they want to control what's going on the European continent. And also kind of a, it's an exercise in improving their fallen demographics. So Russia has been losing people at a worrying, tempo, and they do need new people to sort of, to be able to control the vast territory that they're having. So they are deporting Ukrainian children, they are re-educating Ukrainian youth, and they're trying to replete the population that is depleting in the vast expanses of Russia. So I would. If you ask me what kind of resources are Putin interested in Ukraine, that will be people, not the minerals.
Okay, but according to Forbes, and I think this is a number used by the Ukrainian government, there's about $15 trillion worth of rare earths in the ground underneath Ukraine. And I just wondered, out of curiosity, whether perhaps that's what had motivated people all along. With regards to the safeguards, obviously, NATO troops on the ground is something that is unacceptable to Russia. Does Ukraine see that as being a must in terms of guaranteeing your security?
Now, look, Ukraine looks at something that is going to work against Russia. And we do know that the agreements signed with Russia are worth nothing. I mean, Russia has repeatedly broken the agreements that we've signed with them, or they promises that they resigned it, or they would be just selling outright lies. We've seen this within the last 10 years, so we're not going to trust that. Of course, having some sort of peacekeeping force on the territory of Ukraine is reassuring, be it NATO or UN-led. Also, it's been rumored in the Western press that, at least it's been rumored, that some sort of guarantee has been proposed that in case of another Russian attack, Ukraine will be guaranteed an automatic NATO membership somewhere in the future. This sounds unrealistic, but this is, again, something of an option. So I think Ukraine will try to get the best possible scenario for our people and our country, but we will only trust something that really works. We will not trust in that is just written on the paper, because we do know that Russia will violate any agreement that it signs.
Yeah, NATO membership for Ukraine is something that President Trump has already put on the table and said to the Russians, okay, that's not going to happen. He's made a couple of other commitments and put a couple of other cards on the table as well. He views them as being realistic pledges, namely as well about Ukrainian territory under the control of Russians. That's not going to go back to Ukrainian control, he says. I mean, how did it go down in Ukraine when, before the conversation had even got started, things were already being given away by Washington?
I can tell you it did not go well. Honestly speaking, on the face of it, it looks like all the cards put on the table by President Trump so far are at Ukraine's expense. We have not seen anything that has been done at the Russia's expense, or even the any plans that would require Russia to resign some of its gains or go on any compromise. This did not go well in Ukraine, neither in Europe as a whole. And I think that's the direct consequence of that is that there's more understanding within the EU and Europe as a whole that Europe will have to take more responsibility in the situation, will have to defend itself and increase the defense spending, and will have to take more responsibility with what's going on in Ukraine. And at least some of the European countries are deliberating on the possibility of sending their peacekeepers to Ukraine, whether it's going to be under the NATO umbrella or in any other arrangement. And President Trump, although he stated that he's not sending US troops to Ukraine, but he said he will not oppose European troops present there. So I think this is at least something that looks like a security guarantee. And if that happens, this will be a possibility for the future lasting peace agreement.
One of the things we've heard from President Zelensky while we're talking about safeguards, he says our unity is our strongest safeguard for our future. There must be a sense of disbelief there in Ukraine that now, of all times, there's suddenly this extraordinary war of words between Kyiv and Washington. I mean, how's that affected people's morale? And has it left people feeling vulnerable and somewhat abandoned?
Now, it definitely has been some sort of a shock to Ukrainians, but the fact is that, I mean, after 3 years of a full-scale aggression and 11 years of war with Russia, we've learned that you don't have to be, and you can't be in a despair for too long. So what people are saying, let's concentrate on supporting our troops and making sure that, we do what we can with the resources that we have. And Ukrainians are not going to be, sitting there crying, waiting for some other people to decide their fate. We will do our best. We will try to find a solution. We will talk to other partners. We will persuade our allies, but we will also support our army and make sure that it's strong enough, because there's no other way for us. So although it has been not taken lightly, we are continuing as a society as a whole to oppose Russia. And honestly, again, I will repeat that those statements against President Zelensky, whether you like him or not personally, have united people around him and gave him an extra mandate to act on behalf of all of the Ukrainians.
There's a lot of speculation on TV channels all around the world as to what the methodology is here behind President Trump's approach towards this issue and other issues. But in this particular case, what do people in Ukraine think? Do they think that somehow there is a plan here, and that, keeping this issue in the headlines, having everyone talk about it is somehow, as you're saying, and you've mentioned it just there, that everyone's now rallying around the president of Ukraine. I mean, do people think that's part of President Trump's master plan?
Well, it's very hard to tell. I mean, there's nothing that, can be said for sure. It seems that President Trump is setting the table for negotiations in a way that he likes and had it done before. He definitely wants a quick solution. And of course, it's tempting to have a quick solution at Ukraine's expense. And if this is the sort of a trying to see how far Ukraine can be pushed, Ukrainians are pushing back. And Europeans are pushing back and saying that, well, we do want the peace agreement as well. We do want to stop, the fightings. We do want to stop the bombings of Ukrainian cities, but it's not going to come at our long-term future's expense. And I think in this way, this has been, setting the table by Mr. Trump in a very radical way. It's now our task of Ukraine and our partners in the EU to modify this approach. I think at some point we have already seen President Trump clarifying his words that any agreement on the peace will have to include Ukraine, something that he did not say before. And I think the hope here is that we will be able to communicate in clear terms to his representatives that the major agreement will have to be accepted by the Ukrainian society as a whole. It will have to be accepted and enforced by the EU countries. And the only way to do that is to include them at the negotiating table and also to include their interests and concerns. So I hope that this exercise will serve to mobilize everyone, to crystallize their position, to make them clear. And in this way, it might even lead to quicker, solutions.
President Zelensky has obviously hit back at President Trump in a number of different ways over the past few days. One of the things he said is that President Trump lives in what he called a Russian disinformation space. Is that a view that is widely held in Ukraine, do you think?
I think so, because the first ones who started saying that President Zelensky has not legitimate mandate were the Russians. They've done this last year already. They've also have been speculating that Zelensky has lost the popular support. And these are the messages that Trump is repeating now. He somehow states that this is not just the Russian propaganda, it's position of his administration and many other countries, although we have not seen other countries repeating this. On the contrary, we've seen other countries setting the record straight and saying, well, this is just not true. So in this way, of course, the feeling is that for some reason, the Trump is following the steps of the Russian propaganda.
And despite all of this, is there optimism in Ukraine that President Trump is going to strike a deal for Ukraine that is in Ukraine's interests? Or is there perhaps a sense that something new has to be done here and that Ukraine has to negotiate an end to this without any American involvement? I mean, is that even a realistic scenario?
I don't think that anyone in Ukraine believes in a realistic scenario of having a peace agreement without a clear U.S. Participation and endorsement. So this limits what Ukraine can do and expect. And President Zelensky has clearly stated that he does not believe that European brokered peace without the U.S. can be of a lasting nature. So in this way, Ukraine does need the U.S. support. At the same time, we believe that we can be and will be a reliable partner, not just a country that follows the orders. And in this respect, again, Zelensky compared and said that he believes that Ukraine should get the guarantees at par with Israel, who is also not a part of NATO, but has been enjoying the unwavering support, bipartisan support of the United States. So I think that's one of the options, even without the NATO membership, to have a solution for Ukraine. But again, I think that this will require a concerted effort between the EU and the US. And it seems that the new administration in the US administration has been going against Europe for some reasons on some of the issues. So this is something that is not exclusively concerning Ukraine. It seems that this new administration will try to set some new relations with the European continent as such, and Ukraine will have to be part of it. So I think we're evidencing some bigger shift in transatlantic relations, and it's our common responsibility to ensure that this transatlantic friendship and cooperation partnership will remain as strong as it was, or even stronger, because it serves everybody's interest on both sides of Atlantics.
Sergiy, we're receiving word that General Kellogg and President Zelensky have now met. They've held their talks. They were going to hold a press conference, but it's been cancelled at the request of the Americans. Is there something to be read into that, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say. Only the parties know what actually happened behind the closed doors. Definitely, they don't have an agreement. They have not shaken their hands, as they have nothing to announce so far. And we do know that President Zelensky can be very honest and very, straightforward about his views. And maybe at this point of time, we need another round of exchange of opinions before any public announcements are made. So we're, of course, following very closely what's going on and waiting for, I think, a personal meeting between the President of Ukraine and President of the United States. This is where the real decisions will be made. This is the meeting that everybody expects, and that's where the press will be waiting for a real press conference. So at this point of time, I wouldn't be too worried. I think that we are still at the stage where the parties have different positions, and they're only just trying to narrow it down to something they can agree upon.
And just lastly, I mean, in terms of the message that General Kellogg takes back to Washington, we heard this from President Zelensky last night. He said, America needs success just as much as we do. Do you think General Kellogg is going to be able to persuade President Trump that is indeed in Washington's best interests to make sure this deal is a success?
I think only a strong Ukraine will be a bulwark defending Europe from any further Russian aggression. And in this way, I think this message should, persuade President Trump, because Ukraine has proven that with this army and the technologies that has been applied, it is able to withstand the Russian aggression with the forces that are 3 times as big as Ukrainian ones. And, the hands of the safe Europe lie somewhere, at the eastern border of Ukraine. So if he does want to have a stable European continent, it is only possible where Ukraine is strong and able to defend itself and, by definition, all of Europe for the foreseeable future and even after that. So I think this is the message that should ring the bells and should make sense in Washington.
OK, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate you speaking to us. Sergiy Petukhov, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Meanwhile, European leaders have been expressing concerns about being sidelined from Ukraine peace talks. This after the US and Russia held direct negotiations in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, without any European or Ukrainian presence. Well, now the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is set to travel to the United States next week to meet with President Trump to discuss Europe's role in helping to end the war. Well, in response to President Trump's comments, the British Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy has told the BBC that her country doesn't place too much weight on what the president says, emphasising that actions speak louder than words. The important thing with President Trump, she says, is what he does. Well, Nandy also called on all sides to turn down the heat in their discussions over Ukraine.
We want to take the heat out of the situation, and some of the words that have been used in recent days have been very heated, but we don't see that as helping to provide a solution for Ukraine. And the Prime Minister has been very clear that we need to take the heat down, that we need to work with all sides. And we've been very encouraged by both the public and private conversations that he's been able to have with world leaders over the last few weeks, and is heading to the United States to have that conversation with President Trump and his administration. And we're encouraged by some of the words from the US Secretary of State for Defence, from the Secretary of State, and others, that they believe that that is in the United States' interests as well.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Sir Gerald Howarth, the former UK Defence Minister, who joins us from the United Kingdom. Great to have you back with us here on Al Arabiya News, Sir Gerald. We're also joined by Halper Hayes, who is a former member of President Trump's White House transition team. Great to see you again as well. Let me start with you, Jan, because according to President Trump, the Ukrainian president is a, quote, dictator. He and NATO are to blame for the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, that sounds suspiciously familiar. That's the Kremlin narrative, isn't it?
Well, actually, the unprovoked was a good cover. And when you think about who poked the bear, it wasn't Russia and it wasn't the Ukraine. It actually was US diplomats, politicians, and NATO. Because in 1990, it was guaranteed to Gorbachev that they would not move 1 inch eastward, to quote former Secretary of State James Baker. And the fact that they kept entertaining bringing Ukraine into NATO was really the crux of the issue.
So, Gerald, your thoughts on President Trump using what sounds like the Kremlin's lines to take, and also reacting there on what Jan's just said?
Yes, I think it is extraordinary that we have a United States president siding with a war criminal, a man who has no concept of democracy, who has eliminated most of his political opponents, and who has formed alliances with some of the most brutal regimes in the world, like North Korea, like Iran, like the Chinese Communist Party. It just beggars belief. And as former United States and former President Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, said that this is a shameful behavior by the United States. And the idea that Russia was provoked by Ukraine or provoked by NATO, absolute, complete and utter rubbish. The provocation came from one source only, and that was from Russia. Putin invaded part of Georgia, a sovereign state, in 2008, and took South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In 2014, he invaded part of another sovereign state, Ukraine, Crimea, in 2014, and now in 2020 and 2022 invaded the rest of Ukraine. And he has done it with complete impunity. And it is the failure of the West to stand up to this tyrant that has brought us to where we are today.
Jan, I must let you respond to that. And I also just want to ask you about the notion, therefore, according to the Ukrainian president, that President Donald Trump lives in what he called a Russian disinformation space. How do you respond to all of that?
Well, I understand the other guest's perspective, and I was waiting for someone to bring up Bolton, because if Bolton can say anything bad about Trump, he would. But you know, Trump gave an interview, and he said that the reason he brought Bolton to North Korea, wouldn't let him speak, was just because him standing there threatened Kim Jong-un, because Bolton is known to support war. Trump is not a neocon. And we can criticize him all we want. But what bothers me is that we're not looking at the perspective from both sides. I don't know enough about the issues with Crimea, but it goes back to 2014. We need to look at that. And if anyone thinks that NATO pushing and going against an agreement, let's just look at this, all right? Russia promised Ukraine that if they got rid of their nuclear weapons, that they would not invade. Well, Russia broke that promise and went into Crimea. How can you trust on that side but NATO and Thatcher, Mitterrand, Kohl, George H.W. Bush, his Secretary of State, all made in the treaty, made commitments. And so these commitments continue to be broken over the years, and it builds up hostilities. If we're only looking at this from today or even the past 2 or 3 years, then we're not analyzing it properly.
Okay, so Gerald,
if I may say, that is an absurd analysis. Forgive me, but what we should be looking at is the Budapest Budapest Memorandum of December 1994, which was signed by Boris Yeltsin on behalf of the Russian Federation, by President Bill Clinton on behalf of the United States, by Prime Minister John Major on behalf of the United Kingdom, and the then Ukrainian president, under which Ukraine agreed to give up its entire arsenal of nuclear weapons, in return for which its independence, its sovereignty, and its existing borders was to be respected by the parties thereto. I'm afraid that Russia is in flagrant breach of that agreement that was signed by Boris Yeltsin, but I'm afraid the President of the United States is also now in breach of that agreement by tantamount to agreeing to allow the borders of Ukraine to be changed from what they were in 1994, and even to be changed without consulting the Ukrainian people, let alone their president. I think this is utterly shameful, leaving the United Kingdom as the only man standing prepared to honor that agreement of 1994. It wasn't an Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine, I accept that, but to undertake, as they all did, solemnly to respect the borders and the sovereignty of Ukraine, and to agree and to undertake to refrain from any military action. It has been completely breached by Putin, and I cannot understand how the President of the United States can be so unbelievably naive as to accept any assurances he's been given by Putin, let alone the wily Lavrov, the foreign minister who's been there since 2004. This is a disgusting regime. Its opponents have a habit of falling out of windows in Moscow. And look at the number of young, sensible Russians who have fled the country to avoid being caught up in this appalling war which is taking place on their borders. I'm afraid to say I have no time. Having said that, there were some things that President Trump did when he first came in, of which I approved, not least his dismissal of federal employees engaged in diversity, equality, and inclusion. But this is an international issue. He's in breach of an agreement which his predecessor, Bill Clinton, signed, and I think that it is monstrous.
Okay, let's move on to some of the rhetoric that's being used. According to President Trump, President Zelenskyy is a dictator. Jan, where do you think he's coming from here?
One of the things to know in understanding Trump's messaging is that he uses it to either float an idea, to deflect, or to distract from something else. He knew that the media would seize upon this and everyone would need to be talking about it. And it was a ploy. It's one of his many, many ploys. I, for 10 years, have tried to explain to the media how to connect the dots and how to understand his optics and when he chooses to say something.
Okay, is it helpful to call him a dictator when, we're in these very early stages of negotiation between the Russians and the Americans, for President Trump to label... Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Knowing Trump as I do, calling him a dictator was in response to Zelenskyy saying that he lives in a world of disinformation. Okay.
I mean...
well, he did live in a world of disinformation because he went along with the idea that President Zelenskyy enjoys 4% support in Ukraine. Absolute rubbish. He enjoys 57% support in Ukraine. So why on earth did the President of the United States tell what was manifestly a complete lie? He is fracturing NATO, siding with NATO's long-standing enemies, a country which has got a history of aggression, and which, if it is not stopped in Ukraine, will certainly go elsewhere, not least probably to Moldova, and perhaps to take the Suwalki Gap between Kaliningrad, which is a Russian enclave on the Baltic coast, and the...
Trump
and Belarus. And can I just say, Jan,
let Gerald finish.
Jan, your president has no right. Your president has no right unilaterally to try to force the capitulation of a sovereign state, Ukraine, particularly when his country is party to that agreement to respect the sovereignty, independence, and existing borders of Ukraine as they applied in 1994. And I'm afraid, Jan, I think you should be ashamed as well.
Jan, let me
Well-
respond. I'll let you respond.
You know, I always find it interesting when people need to value judge because we have a disagreement or we see things differently. There are a lot of international laws that have been violated. I forget the point I was going to make in response to something that he said, but I clearly hear your position, sir, and I understand where you're coming from. But what is missing in what you're saying is that it is so one-sided and you hate Russia. So what Trump is trying to do is trying to bring those sides and those issues and those feelings to the surface because he's a great negotiator and he listens. The peace agreement and what happens going forward, we cannot make judgments on news of the day. He has got Marco Rubio, John Radcliffe, CIA, and Mike Waltz, NSC. They're in Ukraine working on negotiating with them. And right now, the proposals have not been flushed out enough. But I think that also Zelensky made a mistake by having a temper tantrum about not being in Saudi Arabia, because you know that when there are negotiations, it is best to have one-on-one to understand a person's position, or else you end up having a semi-debate like we're having here with this guy telling me I'm absurd and I should be embarrassed. There are things that I could say back to you, but if you don't look at what
Forgive me, Jan. Forgive me, Jan. I'm not this. Forgive me, Jan. I'm not this guy. I'm a former British Defence Minister. I'm a former Member of Parliament of the United Kingdom. I'm a former Parliamentary Private Secretary to Margaret Thatcher. I have a long history of being involved in politics. Do not say I hate Russia. I do not hate Russia. I actually worked for the Sukhoi Design Bureau. You probably never heard of them. The Sukhoi Design Bureau are the design bureau which designed some of Russia's most formidable combat aircraft. I did that 30 years ago because I felt that it was important to try to bring Russia on side. What has happened is his country has been usurped by Putin and his henchmen, who are a bunch of evil people. And I come back, what right does the President of the United States have to seek to negotiate with this tyrannical regime, guilty of war crimes, over the head of the country whose borders are being decided? It is just completely outrageous. And when you say that Trump is a great negotiator, so what he's been saying is that because America has given some support to Ukraine, militarily speaking, that entitles the United States to hoover up all the rare earth minerals that exist in Ukraine, and that if he doesn't comply with that, well, America will desert him. I have to say, I have never in my whole political experience come across such an extraordinary display of international diplomacy, which completely, of course, abuses the word diplomacy. But this is extremely dangerous for the future of the whole of the West. He's fracturing NATO. He's just giving every possible encouragement to Putin. So when Putin and his henchmen then go somewhere else, what is the President of the United States going to do then?
Well, I find it very interesting that your voice tone changed completely when you said some nice things about Russia, but in your previous comments, your detest for them was coming through so clearly. And
it was not detest for the Russian people, it's detest for this regime. This is a most heinous regime. I mean, there's just a report in the Daily Telegraph today that female Ukrainian prisoners of war have been tortured and paraded naked through the snow by Russian troops. For goodness sake, what on earth are we doing in the West, cozying up to the people responsible for these atrocities? It just beggars belief, and I just hope the American people who voted, particularly those who voted to Trump for Trump, and I tried to explain to people here why I thought the American people were going to vote for Donald Trump. And I was no supporter of Kamala Harris, I have to say.
OK, when it comes to decoding and deciphering President Donald Trump, some quite interesting analysis put forward appropriately by the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and I'd like to get both of your thoughts on this. He's playing down a lot of the Trump rhetoric of the last couple of days, saying, quote, this is not intended to be historically accurate, but to shock Europeans into action. A sort of tough love approach, says Boris Johnson. Jan, your thoughts, and then I'd love to get yours as well, Sir Gerald.
Well, that relates back to the comment that I made of how he uses his comments. He floats to see responses. He will distract if he's doing something that he doesn't want the media to pay attention to. He'll deflect, meaning switch course, or he will float something and then give his response to it. But Boris Johnson is exactly right. Trump knows how to play the media, and he is a different person behind the scenes. But he is doing this because he wants to hear the opinion of very senior, experienced politicians, as the other guest is, and because what it does is when you've got Rubio, Ratcliffe, and Walz at the table with the European leaders, they are going to know what the issues are and they can come prepared. We can't make any conclusions on things that are being reported right now.
So, Gerald, what are your thoughts on what Boris Johnson said with regards to how we should interpret the US president?
Well, I've always said that one of the things that Putin would find difficult was that he's a chess player and he sees moves being done carefully and studiedly, whereas we never know what President Trump is going to say next, and I suspect nor does he. And that is one of the disconcerting things that Moscow has had to deal with until now, of course. But as far as the rhetoric in respect of the Europeans is concerned, yes, it has had an effect. The NATO summit in 2014, David Cameron, then our Prime Minister, made it absolutely clear that other European NATO countries had to step up to the plate as far as the NATO budget was concerned. And there's no doubt that President Trump's first presidency had some effect. I said to the Prime Minister, Theresa May, before she went to see Donald Trump at the start of his first presidency, and she had to make it crystal clear to him how NATO was important, not just to us, but to the United States as well, because in the run-up to the election, he threatened to take America out of NATO. And she smiled at me and said, "I've already done it, Gerald." And there's no doubt he reviewed his position and supported NATO. And he's quite right, and we are all right, that the NATO countries, the European NATO countries, have to do far more than they have been. They cannot rely, they should not rely on the US taxpayer for the bulk of NATO's expenditure. And furthermore, they should not be engaged in trying to create an alternative to NATO, which is this EU defense identity, which I think is a fundamental error. I saw firsthand how they tried to organize themselves, and I just thought it was very pathetic. Whereas NATO has been the guarantor of our security in Europe and North America for the past 80 years. And I find that the president's attitude is cavalier towards the continuation of that security agreement, which has kept the peace in Europe and wider.
OK, and in terms of getting shocking Europe into action, the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, the French President Emmanuel Macron, travelling to the United States next week. They're going to be speaking to President Trump to discuss a role for Europe in ending the war. Jan, how do you rate their chances in getting across to President Donald Trump a different set of messages and a rather different narrative to the one he appears to have?
On a 1 to 10 scale, I'd give it a 2 to 4.
Okay,
he doesn't have much respect for Keir Starmer. So, and Keir Starmer was really only elected by 1/3 of the population or the voting population. And what percentage is unhappy with him right now? He is completely opposite to what all of his policies and his philosophies are opposite to Trump's. It's going to be very interesting to see what comes out of it. But I don't think Keir Starmer is going to make much headway.
OK, so Gerald, how do you rate the British Prime Minister's chances? And he is going accompanied by another European leader in the form of the French President.
Yes, that's unfortunate, I fear, because President Macron was the one who sought to cozy up to Putin right at the outset of the attempt to annex the whole of Ukraine when the tanks were parked outside Kyiv. So I think that's unfortunate. Also, Macron is the architect of this European defence, EU defence identity. I'm all for the European members of NATO getting together, but not under the banner of the European Union. But having said that, I have agreed with much of what Keir Starmer, I'm obviously an opponent of all his policies domestically, and I would take Britain out of the European Court of Human Rights and all of that. Having said that, though, I think he has behaved correctly as far as Ukraine is concerned. And I just hope that that President Trump does listen to him. And if Jan is right, and I'm not sorry for my forgive me for my stance. I've been in politics a long time. I came into politics because I was brought up in Germany. I saw the Iron Curtain. I saw the whole suppression of freedom. On the other side, I saw the misery of communism, and I wanted to do my bit to try to ensure that capitalism, free markets, free society, freedom of speech, all of that was preserved. And thanks to President Ronald Reagan, thanks to Margaret Thatcher, and thanks to the Russian president at the time, fortunately, the Cold War was ended and a new future beckoned, but unfortunately, that has not happened as those two great leaders, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, had hoped. So this relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom is extremely important. We are both we both have the nuclear deterrent. We both share the same nuclear missiles, and we share a lot in military intelligence. And I do not want to see President Trump fracture all of that.
OK, and just lastly, Jan, we've had the...
I have a hard stop. I'm sorry.
OK. All right, Jan.
Go ahead.
We'll let you go. If you've got to go, we'll let you go, and we'll end it there. Appreciate it. We really appreciate having had both of you.
Can I just say, Sir Gerald, I have enjoyed listening to you. And
well, thank you very much. I'm sorry.
I really have.
I feel passionately about it, Jan. And if I've got through to you my passion, I mean, I'm a Republican. You know, I mean, in terms of the U.S. politics, of course, I'm a monarchist here, but I'm a Republican, and it grieves me intensely to see my Republican friends not standing up for freedom. Yes, there's corruption in Ukraine. I was chairman of the All-Party Ukraine Group. There's corruption in Ukraine. I understand that, and we have to. I told President Poroshenko, so when this is all over, if you do not eliminate corruption in your country, your friends who stood by you in this difficult time are going to be absolutely disgusted. And he understood that. But we've got to stand by freedom. This is all that our former leaders, our great leaders, have been seeking to do.
Sir Gerald,
Good,
I hope
agreed.
to make your acquaintance. And Michael,
All right.
thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. Halper Hayes, really appreciate your time, and we hope to facilitate that introduction to the pair of you. Sir Gerald Howarth as well, former UK Defence Secretary. It's been a real pleasure having you back here on Al Arabiya News.
Thank you, Tom.
And finally, President Trump is promising to carry out an audit and count the gold reserves being held at Fort Knox, the famed depository for much of the US government's gold reserve. Well, according to the US Treasury, more than 8,100 tons of gold bullion are held at the facility, which is closely guarded by the US military. Well, Fort Knox is the most famous repository for gold. However, vast quantities are also held in vaults in West Point, Denver, as well as the Federal Reserve in New York. Well, the last official visit to Fort Knox was reportedly in 2017. Well, this has fueled ongoing discussions about transparency. President Trump's recent comment on auditing the gold storage follows on from questions raised by Elon Musk as to whether or not the reserves are safe. Well, President Trump says, quote, he'll be upset if the gold isn't there.
We're going to go into Fort Knox to make sure the gold is there.
Are they going to?
You know that we're going to go into Fort Knox. The things we do want to look. I mean, we hope everything's fine with Fort Knox, but we're going to go to Fort Knox, the fabled Fort Knox, to make sure the gold is there.
Where would the president brought up?
If the gold isn't there, we're going to be very upset.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thanks for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a look back at some of the week's most exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.